mission.
And so once again we see America building up the military capacity, the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union.
Well, this goes, when you talk about MIRVing of missiles, you're talking about a quantum jump in your military technology. Now, I'm not a military man, but to me, the ability to do that is a massive leap forward, and we enabled them to do it, and we did it knowingly and deliberately.
During the Vietnamese War, the Soviet Union and the Eastern European satellites were the primary suppliers of war materials to the North Vietnamese who were killing American boys in South Vietnam. Would you comment on our aid and trade with the Soviet Union and with the Eastern European satellites during that period of time?
Well, there's no question that the Soviets were the prime suppliers of military equipment and suppliers to the North Vietnamese. Let me give you an example. The American pilots, as they flew over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, described the trucks that they were seeing as American trucks. Well, they were American trucks because they came from the Gorky plant, and Gorky was built by Henry Ford. And so you have the situation where we were, in effect, supplying both sides in the Vietnamese War.
But the trucks were being built by the Soviet Union. However, were they getting any materials from the United States to help build those trucks?
Yes, in the early 1970s, I know specifically of shipments of equipment into the Gorky plant while the war was going on, which in effect were aiding the Soviets to build more trucks to be used by the North Vietnamese.
How about loans? Was America extending loans to the Soviet Union during this period when they were the primary financiers of the North Vietnamese?
Yes. Beginning about 1970, there was a massive grant of loans to the Soviet Union. I'd say by about 1976, it must have totaled perhaps $40 billion outstanding. And so this, of course, these loans were used to enable the Soviet Union to purchase industrial equipment in the United States, and this industrial equipment was used to manufacture, in part, military supplies which were used against us in Vietnam.
How about Russian shipping that was being used to ferry supplies to North Vietnam?
Shipping is a very interesting example because the Soviets published a shipping register, about 6,000 ships, and I analyzed every one of these ships, both the origin of the technology of the ship itself, the hull, and the engine. Most of them are marine diesel engines. And I find that 60% of the Soviet merchant marine, which of course has military usefulness, 60% was built abroad. Only 40% in the Soviet Union, and that largely to Western design. But when you come to marine diesel engines, you find something really fascinating. You find that 80% of the marine diesel engines in Soviet merchant ships are Western engines, Burmeister & Wain of Copenhagen, Sulzer of Switzerland, Fiat of Italy, because that name has come up before. But the other 20% of marine diesel engines built in the Soviet Union are built to Western design under technical assistance contracts from Sulzer and Burmeister & Wain. So in effect, there could be no Soviet merchant marine without assistance from the West.
How about the building of the Kama River plant?
Kama River was built in the late 1960s, early 1970s. The basic design, the contract was let to the Italian firm of FIAT. Giovanni Agnelli is the chairman of the board. And this is important because Agnelli is tied in with Chase Manhattan Bank. He's on the International Advisory Committee of Chase Manhattan. What caught my attention was that FIAT does not manufacture automobile manufacturing equipment. All the FIAT plants in Italy contain American equipment. And what I found was that the equipment was coming, perhaps about 60-70% of it, from the United States, from major automobile equipment suppliers in the United States. I think it was known as the Fiat plant as a cover to perhaps divert attention from the fact that during the Vietnamese War we were building the largest plant in the world. It covers 36 square miles. We were building for the Soviets, with American equipment, the largest plant in the world. And so it was called the Italian Fiat plant, and I think this was a blind.
And so they were building their trucks and armored personnel carriers and other things that could be used then for warfare in South Vietnam?
We knew that the Kama plant had military potential. In 1972, I wrote it in National Suicide. I said as much in Miami Beach in 1972. This plant has military potential. It can produce military vehicles. We knew it. And of course today in Afghanistan we find that the Karma vehicles that are there in Afghanistan today from the Karma plant built by American and Italian companies.
And it was after you brought out this information that efforts were made to suppress your book, National Suicide, and your other studies?
Yes, because I was bringing out the fact that the Karma River plant had military potential, that we were moving the missiles with the Bryant chucking grinder equipment, and of course other facts along these lines.
And what sort of pressure was brought to bear upon you? What sort of pressure was brought to bear upon the publisher of your book, National Suicide?
There was pressure on the publisher to prevent publication, to stop publication. He refused to do so. There's pressure brought upon me first to withdraw the book, and then a rather deceitful sort of pressure. It was claimed at the Hoover Institution that I had plagiarized Volume 3 of my Western Technology series, which was being published by Stanford University. Well, firstly, I challenged them to point out the plagiarization, and nobody could find even 2 sentences that matched up. But then I pointed out that I cannot plagiarize my own work. I hold the copyright on both books, and nowhere in the world can I plagiarize myself. That's a logical impossibility. And then gradually it built up over the following years that my research was perhaps going a little out of what was perhaps required, or welcome would be a better word, and it should be confined within more narrow boundaries. And at that point in 1975 I left the Hoover Institution, and since then I've become an independent author, and I can publish what I want to publish. Do
you know of any other instances where efforts were made to suppress publication of books through the Hoover Institute?
I know one example, one I was personally aware of, and that was Julius Epstein's book on Operation Keyhole, which is a very important book on the treatment of Russian prisoners of war in Germany after World War II. This book was in manuscript for several years, and he was not allowed to publish it. I heard that firsthand from Julius.
Right, and eventually it was, of course, brought out.
It was at a later point. Now, another example I can give is my own Western Technology series. The 3rd volume of that was held in galleys for 1 year. Now, it costs a lot of money to hold a book in galleys, because when a book is in galleys, you want to get it out on the market to start recouping your investment. That book was held in galleys for 1 year because it was not politically wise or acceptable to publish it at that time, even though it was an academic book.
Now, you've done some fascinating studies on the Trilateral Commission. Can you tell us about the Trilateral Commission?
The Trilateral Commission is a private organization founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. It was essentially financed by Rockefeller and some of the foundations, Kettering Foundation, Danforth Foundation, Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation was a very major contributor. And the stated objective is to encourage discussion amongst what they call the trilateral regions. I should point out that of the 300 members, 1/3 come from the United States, 1/3 from Japan, and 1/3 from Europe. But in effect, I find that the actions of the Trilateral Commission are very much self-interested on the part of the international banking community in New York.
Now, as far as the Trilateral Commission's influence on the American government is concerned, it's been said that there was a very excessive representation of the Trilateral Commission in Jimmy Carter's cabinet and in Jimmy Carter's administration.
Well, excessive is rather an understatement. I think there's some 200 million people in the United States. There are only 77 trilateral members who are American. Out of that 77, I counted no fewer than 18 trilateralists. That's about 1/3 of the American trilateral contingent turns up in the Carter administration. Mr. Carter himself is a trilateral, Mr. Mondale, Mr. Brown, Mr. Vance, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Brown, Secretary of Defense. In other words, they occupy all the senior cabinet and sub-cabinet posts. In fact, there's some key committees, intelligence and defense committees, which are only comprised of trilaterals. So here you've got 77 Americans selected by one man, David Rockefeller, who's chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and we find that they turn up in the key controlling positions in Washington under the Carter administration.
And would this suggest to you that perhaps we do not select the government, that it is selected by these people who work behind the scenes?
You can come to no other conclusion. If you look today at who's running for office, you find Mr. Bush is a trilateral, you find Mr. Anderson is a trilateral, Mr. Carter's a trilateral.
We find articles appearing in Newsweek magazine, Time magazine, U.S. News and World Report, many of the major media telling us there's really nothing to be concerned about from the Trilateral Commission. Is there any interlock between the Trilateral Commission and the major media in the United States?
Yes, there is an interlock, particularly in the news media. For example, the Chicago Sun-Times, the executive editor there, James Hoagie, is a trilateral. You'll find Saul Leinowitz is a director of Time magazine, and I think, yes, Henry Schacht is a director of CBS. So there very definitely is an interlock between the trilaterals and the media.
And perhaps this is the reason, then, that they rather play down the influence of the Trilateral Commission on contemporary American government.
Yes, I had a computer survey made of all articles that have been printed on the Trilateral Commission since 1973. I could find worldwide only 73 articles.
Now, what's the relationship between the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations?
Well, of course, the Council on Foreign Relations is a much older organization founded in 1920. I did a study in which I compared trilaterals with or without membership in the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. I find there's something over 50% overlap.